Welcome back to the channel. Chris Morrison, Gulfside Ministries. Tim back with us again, as I think I've lost count. We're on part 10.
I
I
think this is
think,
10, yeah.
yeah, of our study in Hebrews. We're over in chapter 9. We've had a phenomenal conversation, in my personal opinion. By the way, if you're watching this as we do these, I did get the MP3s pulled out, Tim, and so now all of these are available in a podcast format. And we're in the process of shopping around and finding an actual podcast distributor. But for the time being, you can go to gulfsideministries.wordpress.com. It's on the link. As of when I'm recording this, that's where it is. So you guys who, if you want to watch it or listen to it rather while you're working out or something, that'll now be available. So that's out there. So
Cool, thank you.
yeah. And then the other thing before we jump into our next text is there was a comment that I just wanted to get your take on real quick that was just asking about the kind of covenantal theology, dispensationalism distinction as it relates to Hebrews. I'm pretty sure I'm trying to read the commenter's mind here that might have come out of my raising the question about supersessionism, which is kind of odd as I raise that, because I'm thinking of that from a dispensational perspective, and the commenter is kind of arguing against dispensationalism. So just real quick, Tim, eschatology matters and it affects hermeneutics. And so you have any quick thoughts on eschatology, on covenant theology, on dispensationalism, particularly as it relates to our conversation so far?
Well, I mean, one of the things I would notice is we haven't hit a text, at least to my eye so far, that says, okay, we just have to be covenant guys now.
Right.
Nor have we hit a text that says, okay, we got to be dispensational and here's why. That hasn't happened at this point in the book. And, perhaps it will happen in chapter 9, but it hasn't happened yet. And I'm always suspicious when someone wants to make a jump to a big system and then inject that into it. We're trying to fly very low and very tight to the text. If the text takes us there, great. And I'm not suspicious of big systems. Something like God has an overview of all theology, and something is true. Like there is a big system where it all fits together.
Right.
But I am suspicious of trying to make a leap to a big system in the middle of an exegetical conversation.
Yeah. And that's probably worth keeping in mind, the level of the theological discourse. There is exegetical theology, which is what we're trying to do. And there is above that, biblical theology and systematic theology. And those things are real and they exist and we can't ignore them. But I think you have done a really good job of staying close at the level of exegetical theology. And so I don't want to deny that your systematics will never influence exegetical,
of course they do.
But that should be minimal and when so justified.
And a lot of that is sort of error checking. Like if I'm slugging my way through a passage, got my nose in the weeds, doing all the, doing the word studies, diagramming sentences, doing all the things, and I come out like, man, if I'm reading this right, I think I should have 3 wives. I might want to look again.
Right. Right, for sure.
There's systematic theology at its best is remembering what you read elsewhere while you're reading here. And systematic theology at its worst is insisting on hearing what I read elsewhere while I'm reading here rather than reading here. But it does all have to go together.
Right.
And if I begin to think that I have come across a fundamental insight here and all I need to do is decanonize about 3 or 4 books and we're really going to get somewhere, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong with my exegesis.
This bit needs to be 60 seconds to be clipped out because unfortunately in the circles that I walk in, and I suspect that you're very closely associated with, there are some people in the YouTube world that are back to talking about decanonizing certain books of the Bible because it doesn't fit with their soteriology. And that's problematic. It does happen.
Goodness.
Yeah, they're back to that stuff again. So I will offer to our commenter and anybody in general, if you do see something where you feel like that there's a particular point being read in, didn't this come from your theology? By all means, please put those in the comments and interact, because again, the goal here is to stay pretty close to the text. And as we said, the very, very first video, it's to go try to give a positive theology rather than try to explain away. Because in Hebrews, very often what happens is people explain away difficult passages rather than try to see what the text actually positively asserts, right?
Okay, so there's two temptations here. The first one is to get occupied with what it can't say, what it must not be allowed to say, what it doesn't say.
Right.
And I'm trying to be obedient here, so I need to know what it does say. Trying to get closer to God, not just know what he didn't say. And the other one is to take part of what it says, to hear an easy application and then miss a bigger picture. So the easy application in Hebrews is don't go back to the temple system, don't abandon Jesus, break up with Jesus on Instagram and go back to the temple kind of situation. As it were. But there's actually a bigger picture, which we're about to get into in chapter 9, of what it is he's telling them about why they shouldn't.
Right. So you could argue, it sounds like that the easy application is kind of a downstream historical application, but then there's something maybe that this is a bigger picture of, is kind of what I'm kind of hearing, something like that.
Which is where we started, because you remember early on, like as we were coming into this, asking the question, okay, I'm not a Hebrew, I'm not living in Jerusalem before AD 70. I'm not in danger of going back to the temple sacrificial system. What does this book have for me?
So what does this do for me? Exactly.
A lot, as it turns out.
It has for me so far. So, well, why don't we use this as an excuse to go and get into the text now? Anything else you want to press before we look at chapter 9?
Yeah, sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. All right, Tim, take it away. Hebrews 9, the earthly sanctuary that we started talking about last time.
So, yeah, calling back to 8, remember, he's pointing out in chapter 8 that Moses is building this earthly sanctuary based on a heavenly sanctuary that God showed him. So it's not just the verbal description that we have. He's also shown something. And we're going to see that actually. We'll get to that. It comes up again in chapter 9. But so we're looking back. If a new covenant is going to be made and the first covenant is becoming obsolete and growing old and about to vanish away. But while we're on the subject, let's talk about that first covenant. What do we know? So then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary, for a tabernacle was prepared. The first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary, and behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now, if that's not an invitation.
Right.
And this is important. He's not saying, there's nothing to talk about there. There's a ton to talk about there. We don't have time.
Right.
That's
all described in Exodus, I think. That's the latter part of Exodus, right?
Go back to Exodus, read it, think it through again. Israel was being taught something.
Yeah.
In that. And Moses saw the heavenly sanctuary, but any Israelite that has access to the Torah, like they're never going to see, unless you're a Levite, at least, if not a priest, you're never going to see the inside of the holy place.
Right.
That lampstand, only time you're going to see it is when they collapse the tent and they're carrying it. You're never going to see it all set up and ready to go. Never going to happen.
Right.
But you have it described in excruciating detail. I mean, that second half of Exodus and then Leviticus, that's the Bermuda Triangle of Bible reading plans.
Right.
Like
No one reads that. That's where they
that's
stop
where
and
New
they
Year's resolutions having to do with Bible reading go to die.
absolutely.
And what our authors are telling us is you should go back and read that again.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know now, knowing that Jesus is ministering, that's the shadow of the place that Jesus is ministering right now as our high priest, knowing that, you should read it again.
Right. So this is your invitation to a Christological hermeneutic, a hermeneutic that's mostly about Jesus, right? Is that
You're going to get
overstating it?
yourself in trouble with a whole different crowd there.
Absolutely. That's the goal. Let's get in trouble here.
Yeah. Let's be even-handed and get in trouble with everyone.
That's right.
That's one of the hallmarks of exegetical theology. But there's lessons to be had about priesthood, about what it means to serve as a priest, about that are built into this. And I mean, joining our authors of these things, we cannot now speak in detail, but by the book that will eventually come of this, I'm sure we'll have an excursus on it.
There you go. Very good. I do just want to say real quick, not to go too far aside, do you have a thought as to why, and maybe you've already mentioned it, maybe it's already come up implicit in your discussion so far. He kind of mentions these first four verses, all these things that are out there, and then he's like, and I'm mentioning them not to talk about them. It's kind of like, well, what's that about? Why is he mentioning them just to say I'm not going to talk about them?
Well, why do you show a movie trailer, Chris?
Very good.
We're going somewhere else. You came into the theater to watch a different movie, but we're going to show you something before we let you watch the thing you came for. He's teasing something, and it's going to be important as he moves further in. You'll hear people say, truly good Bible teachers will say all the time, like the commentary you absolutely must have if you're going to understand Hebrews is the Torah.
Right.
Right. You need to read Exodus. You need to read Leviticus. Hebrews will not make sense without them. And it's true. The fact that he gets all the way down into the contents of the Ark of the Covenant is this is not just a big box, a parable has one main point kind of thing. You can get into the weeds on this.
You could. Yeah, sure. That makes sense.
And
it implies an argument to me. Even the first covenant had all these things. This is not the time and the place for us to go into that. But if that even that had that, then it's going to be important for the second aspect. It's just it's like an invitation to do more is kind of what I'm hearing.
And there will be, as we get further into the duties that he is exhorting his readers to, not running away from Christ is kind of the least of it.
Yeah.
And everything that Exodus and Leviticus teach us about how priesthood works is going to become important to living into the actual charge that he's going to give.
Got it. Yep. Okay.
And so now we begin to talk about, okay, we don't have time to get into all the furniture, but let's talk about the service for a minute. Now, when these things had been thus prepared, the priests always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing the services. But into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. This is a really important claim. Our authors are claiming that if you read Exodus and Leviticus properly, The Holy
Mhm.
Spirit is showing you that a real way into the presence of God, like something has to happen there that hasn't happened yet.
Mhm.
Which we can look back and see that the high priest, he's got to go every year.
Right.
Jesus made one offering forever. So it's easy, like on this side of it, to look back and go, oh, but the point our authors are making is that's already there.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to read that
And
carefully. Go ahead. Keep talking. I'm still reading.
then there's a little bit more to it. So it was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So we are being shown in the Torah by the fact that we don't, like, your conscience can't be purified. How do we know that? Because if it could be, then you could go into the Holy of Holies, right?
Right.
But you can't. Only the high priest, only once a year. But he has to go once a year to cover your sins again. So in the present time, those sacrifices are still being offered for the original writers and readers. Those gifts and sacrifices are still being offered, and they still can't perfect you. You've got these outward things that were imposed until the time of Reformation. That's a fun phrase. But they can't purify you. If they could, you wouldn't die going into the Holy of Holies.
Right. Well, and arguably, and maybe I'm just off track here. If they could truly purify you, and I guess this is what you're getting at a minute ago, if they truly purify you, would have access. But the fact that you don't, I guess what I'm trying to piece together, you seem to be speaking of, or this passage seems to be speaking of the, I guess the lack of a better word, the law's imperfect inability or lack of ability entirely to really truly set you apart and sanctify you. That there's this system put in place, but it never actually gets you all the way there. That
No, it
seems to be
doesn't.
what, yeah.
And the evidence of that, like the evidence of that we've seen so far, are a priest after the order of Melchizedek was already promised 1,000 years before Christ came almost.
Right.
In David's time, 900s BC, we have this promise that someone else is going to come. In the time of Jeremiah, a few hundred years after that, I'm going to make a new covenant, and specifically said, God puts his finger on the problem, which is that, it's not in your heart.
Right.
And I'm going to put it in your heart. It's going to take a new covenant. I'm going to put it in your heart. That's already on the table here. We just covered that. And so now our authors are pointing out, even before you get to Psalms, even before you get to Jeremiah,
right, it's in the
already
structure
reading
of the
Exodus
system
and
itself.
Leviticus, you should have noticed
right,
that the way into the presence of God, there's something missing. And this is going to get, we're going to get into Exodus 24 later in the chapter, and like this is going to pop up in 3D. But just from the once a year sacrifice, we should already know that.
Right. Right. So again, what's popping out to me based on your talking about your comments here, there's this blood sacrifice here in verse 7. and it's every year, as you just said, and it's for sins committed in ignorance. And so this isn't something that I've just willfully done. This is something really deep in my heart, and the sacrifices aren't getting rid of that. There's this purification issue there, right? And then this is all symbolic of sacrifices that cannot make him who performed the services, it can't make him perfect in regard to conscience. If it could, then that would have been done. But it can't perfect my conscience. There's these constant sins and ignorance. So there's just something intrinsically insufficient. That's what I wanted to use. There's something insufficient about this approach. Why? Verse 10 tells me why it's insufficient. Because it's only concerned with foods and drinks and washings and fleshly ordinances.
And so now the question is, what's the contrast? Okay, if we're saying that was insufficient, like imagine yourself chatting with a Jewish friend in Jerusalem, and you're saying,
Right.
well, that was never sufficient. Look at the Torah. Look at these things that we've pointed out here. The immediate response is going to be, well, what have you got that's better than that?
Right.
Which is a good question, right?
Sure. And they're rightfully zealous for the law.
Yes.
I mean, they care about it deeply and they love it. And the Psalms love the law, right? So, I mean, yeah, what do you have that's better than what God himself has revealed to us is the kind of question that they're imagining.
Well, right. I mean, look at like Psalm 119, open my eyes that I might see wondrous things in your law. Like the expectation there is not that God's going to be like, oh, actually, it's not that great.
Right.
Like, never mind.
Right.
No, the law is holy and just and good, but there's what it can't do and what it can't do.
Right.
So verse 11, but Christ came as a high priest of the good things to come with the greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. So now we're into 8:2, the other part of the main point is where Christ ministers. It's not just that he's the better high priest. Where he ministers is equally important.
Yeah. And this is that tabernacle that Moses saw at the end of Exodus 25.
Yeah, that God showed him the pattern. Christ comes with that tabernacle, not with the blood of bulls, of goats and calves, but with his own blood. He entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. So what do we have that's better? The sacrifice that ends all the sacrifices.
Yeah.
For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? If have you seen a goat? If a goat can take care of your sins for a bit, what can the blood of Jesus do?
That's worth highlighting, by the way. There are some people who are rather insistent that the Old Testament sacrifices didn't literally do anything. They're all mere symbols. But this argument hinges on that the blood of the goat actually did something.
Yes. It sanctifies you. It says it sanctifies you.
Says it right there. Right.
Yeah, we're not saying it never did anything. Stop offering them and see what happens.
Right.
Come to think of it, read Chronicles. See what happens when they did. Stop. No, it's doing something. But so now Jesus is doing something more, something that could never have been accomplished under that covenant by the sons of Aaron, all of whom were fallible, none of whom have access to a sacrifice that can get the job done forever.
Right.
And that covenant doesn't, there is no, and then, this is kind of a weird way to say it, but there's an important way in which there's not an eschatology in that covenant. There is
Mm-hmm.
no, and then one day we're going to offer this sacrifice and it's going to take
Mm.
care of everything. It's
Yeah,
not there.
yeah,
The obsolescence is built in and you can see the signs of it.
right.
We can't just keep doing this forever, but what brings it to an end? Well, something that God promised Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:15.
Right. So there's this kind of hopeful of something out there that has to reveal itself, but it has to be revealed. It's not intrinsic to the law itself, other than the fact that it's a shadow of some greater reality that's coming.
Yeah, and you can read the shadows and fun real life test case that I learned from a missionary friend. Um, so he was with, they're called ethnos now, but new tribes at the time. Um,
Mhm.
in a Stone Age tribe, never had any contact with the gospel, um, that we could trace. All of this is new, and they're doing chronological teaching. So they start in creation to give
Mhm.
context. Well, one of the tribal elders is about to die,
Mhm.
and they're only up through they've just gotten Israel out of Egypt. And this guy's about to die. So one of the
Mhm.
things people always object to about chronological teaching is like it's going to take forever. Why don't you just tell them the gospel already? Um,
Yeah.
and the answer is because we tried that and they don't have context, they don't understand.
Right.
So there are good answers to that. But then this kind of situation crops up. What do you do? Well, the guy's getting close to death's door, so the missionary goes to visit him, sits down with him, and says, I need to talk to you about something and I need it to be private. And they kick everybody else out of the hut.
Mhm.
And then he asks him, are you afraid to die? And the elder says, no. And the missionary says, knowing what you know, why are you not afraid to die? And the elder says, because when God had Abraham take Isaac up on top of the mountain, he provided a ram. And when the angel of death came through the land, there was a Passover lamb. And I don't know how, but I know somehow there's a lamb for me.
Wow. That's phenomenal.
This is from somebody who only knows the story up to about Exodus 15.
Mm.
But man, this is also like, this is the power of pre-modern thinking. when you when you get out of a rationalistic culture and into a culture that knows how to be catechized by a story,
Mhm.
the elder reads it right. And he's trusting and he has no idea. And so then the missionary gets to tell him, look, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, but you can't tell anybody.
That's
Like,
so good.
because we're not there yet.
Yeah. He got to get let in on it. That's so good.
And so he walks him through the rest of the story, and the guy dies in peace. But the guy was going to die in peace anyway because he already got it.
Wow. Wow.
It's there already.
Mm.
And that's like, we're not even to Sinai yet.
Yeah.
So, does going to Sinai take any of that away? No, it doesn't. Does what you get from Sinai really answer the problem completely? No,
Right.
obviously not.
Right. Right. Each Sinai, we're seeing there's a real problem with sin and purification and God's holiness and all these wonderful things. And we're seeing the grace of God that He is providing a way to solve our problem. But we're also saying that the solution so far is not permanent. But it has to refer to something. So we're left waiting on what this permanent solution is.
Yes. And now, like, he's writing a generation, if
Yeah.
that, after the resurrection, saying, we now know.
Yeah.
We had good indication that it had to look something like this, and now we know what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So verse 15, for this reason, he's the mediator of the new covenant. Tagging back to Jeremiah, the new covenant God's going to make. Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant. By means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. So one of the questions, like, you can have various quibbles about the inauguration of the new covenant and what's fulfilled and what's not.
Sure.
But if Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, has he died yet? So
Yeah.
something's in motion.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And he's doing that, like, that eternal inheritance thing. Remember, he, all the way back in chapter 1, he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they.
Right.
Now, it's not just Jesus who has an inheritance. He does all this that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance.
That those who are called may receive. There you go. Yep.
Yes. And you could drag the magnet through the scrapyard here, like, in bringing many sons to glory. It's not, it's all about Jesus. And then again, it's not. Jesus does not intend to walk into heaven alone.
Yeah. First fruits kind of language.
First fruits. Yeah. He's the forerunner. He's bringing an army.
Right. Right. Before you move on to the next section, and I don't want to interrupt you if you have something else to tag on here, I want to go back and ask a question about several traditional theological words that jump out. And given our early conversation on trying to keep close to the text, but then also the reality of how other words can get heard, I want to get your comments on some specific language. Is that okay?
Sure, go for it.
So these are just words that jumped out to me, and I feel like there's a thread here. It talks about, like, starting back in verse 12, we can pick up anywhere, but starting in verse 12, Jesus is obtaining an eternal redemption. And that word, people, come up with a lot. And we see that same word here in verse 15, the redemption, come up. In verse 13, we see the word, that he sanctifies and purifies the flesh. And people have ideas around sanctification. We then have the idea that sanctification here seems to be tied with the cleansing of the conscience. And then, of course, then we get to so those are kind of the big words that I'm noticing. The cleansing of the flesh, the redemption comes up, the sanctification. So when you kind of see those big theological words that we can load a lot of meaning into, would you say something about those kind of loaded meanings? And then maybe what's legitimate, what's not? Can you just kind of speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So this is one of the places where like, this is one of the things seminary students fight over. Is how much to bring to the word and how much to look at the context. So any word, I mean, just going back to very, very basics of how languages work, words don't have meanings, words have possibilities of meaning. It's the combination of that range of possibility is inherent in the word and the context that dials in the meaning. So trunk can be, my favorite English example is, trunk can be the front end of an elephant, the back end of a car, the middle of a tree.
Right.
Or it can be an item of luggage, or, and under normal circumstances, those are pretty easy to tell apart by the context. If you're in the middle of moving house from one place to another, and mom hands the 13-year-old a stack of folded tablecloths and says, go put them in the trunk, and he goes out into the driveway, and there's an old steamer trunk sitting there full of sheets, and then there's the trunk of the car that's got dad's greasy tools in it.
Right.
They could go one of two places, but
Right.
you know, good relations
Right.
with mom hinge on reading this correctly.
Right.
So the word by itself only gets you so far, and then there's context.
Right.
And one of the things that's really important is paying attention to how an author uses a particular word. In Hebrews, sanctified does not mean what American Christians generally mean by it.
Right. Yeah, we tend to think about sanctification as this moral or spiritual progress. I'm getting better and better and better.
Yeah.
Right or wrong. That's a lot of people that I talk to tend to think of
And
sanctification in those terms.
That's a valid biblical meaning of the word in various places, but Hebrews is not doing that with it. The word literally just means to make holy. And the first time we see it is in 2:11. So both the sanctifier and the sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. So Jesus is the sanctifier, the one who sanctifies. We are the sanctified, and he's not ashamed to call us brethren.
And we're far from morally perfect yet.
Right. But we are, and as he develops that discourse, the bringing many sons to glory, we are the sons that are being brought to glory, right?
Right.
Sons of the Father. So, here am I and the children whom God has given me. And as much then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, and so on. This is a thing that has been done. We are children of the Father. If we are children of the Father, then we are sanctified within the meaning of Hebrews. We have been made holy.
Yeah.
Which sets up the address that he's then going to make at the beginning of chapter 3. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling. So you've been made holy. You are holy brothers. So consider Jesus. And then that verb doesn't show up again until Hebrews 9 in verse 13.
Yeah. In connection to, there was a type of sanctification, a setting apart of the flesh, but how much more then would Christ's blood not make us holy?
And again, go back into Leviticus, go back into Exodus, and look at, what do you need the ashes of the heifer for? What do you need that sacrificial blood for? What is it that you sprinkle? You sprinkle things that are not clean yet, and they make them holy. They make those things holy.
Right. And in this case, he uses that word cleanse specifically, and it cleanses your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Again, there seems to be a lot there. We couldn't have been perfected before. And now remember, it says that the conscience was imperfect. And now the conscience has been cleared by the death of Christ, apparently in a way the blood of bulls and goats could not.
Right. But under the law, when you sprinkle implements or the altar or the priest's clothes or whatever with the blood of the sacrifice, and you're using the ashes of the heifer to purify implements, so that makes them holy to the Lord for use in the service.
Right. Who perform services in regard to conscience. So that was holy with regard to their temple services.
Right. Now, this is going to be important for us because we have priestly responsibilities under the new covenant.
Which seems to be dead works couldn't do it before, but now there's a service to the living God in our verse 14.
So the image, they would use that blood that they sprinkled in the ashes of the heifer to purify the implements that are then used in the service of worship in the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
When he asks the question to his Hebrew readers who understand the usage of those things, when he asks, verse 14, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, how much more shall the blood of Christ cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Those things weren't sprinkled with sacrificial blood just so that they could sit around and be holy looking.
Right.
Then the
being
Levites
used.
picked them up and used them.
Yeah.
In the service of the temple. The image that he's using is Christ's blood sprinkles your conscience so that you can serve, like now you are to be used in the heavenly tabernacle.
Right.
You
And
are
good. You
are the implements.
Right. I just want to throw a shout out to a particular, there is a view that's increasing in prominence, and I have recently come to appreciate the value of it myself. The notion of election is a big debate among Calvinists and Arminians and everybody else, but the notion of election unto service, rather than the particular worry about if you're elected to go to heaven or hell and what the basis for that might be. And not without getting into theology of election, the idea there is that what matters is you've been chosen to serve God. And that seems to be, whether that language you want to use the doctrine or not, he's talking about, he's choosing us to serve him. That's what this is about. There's the notion that that's what Christ does, this new covenant. It sets us up so that we can now serve the living God. Am I tracking with you?
Yeah, that's, I mean, nobody, as far as I can tell, no one disagrees with the idea of election to service. The question is which passages are talking about it.
Right. Right. Very good. All right. I feel pretty good about the larger theological terminology in there. Anything else you want to touch on here on these? All right. Sorry for interrupting your flow. You had finished verse 15. All right.
So rolling into 16 now, he's working out the implications of a covenant, where there's a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For the testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. This is basic to like your will. Nobody can come in and claim their part of your estate based on your will if you're still alive. This is kind of important. And so he makes an argument from the lesser to the greater here. Not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood.
Mm-hmm.
So we're back to Sinai here. Moses speaks every precept to all the people according to the law. Then he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you. This is back to Exodus 24.
Mm-hmm.
And he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. So again, we're sanctifying the vessels which are then going to be used. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. So again, go back to, he's taking us back to, and we should go back. Exodus 24 is what he's quoting here.
You want to go look at it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Exodus 24. All right.
So verse 8 is what he's quoting. And the lead up to this is God spoke from the mountain, gave the 10 commandments. Israel's terrified. They tell Moses, you go talk to him and come tell us what he says. We're going to die if we hear this. So Moses goes up and Moses gets it, comes down, presents what God has said, and they answer, all the Lord has said we will do. And so they get up early in the morning, they build an altar at the foot of the mountain, they make the offerings. He sprinkles the book, he reads the book of the covenant in the hearing of the people. They say again, verse 7, all the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. And he sprinkles the people with the blood of the covenant. And then this is fascinating. And then Moses goes up along with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, 70 of the elders. Watch this. And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, like the very heavens in its clarity.
Yep.
But on the nobles of the children of Israel, he did not lay his hand. So they saw God, and they ate and drank. This is not just Moses chatting with God face to face. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, 70 elders. And we know Joshua is also there because he's going to be with Moses in a minute. So
Right.
we've got 75 people at least taking the meat of the sacrifices, coming partway up the mountain, and God appears to them with a sapphire pavement under his feet. Where is that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, is it on the side of Mount Sinai? No, they are seeing into heaven.
Right. Right.
And they eat in the presence of God in heaven on the flank of Mount Sinai somewhere.
Right. That's amazing. Yep.
And then God says to Moses, come on up the mountain. And then there's more.
Mm-hmm.
And he's up on the mountain for 40 days and nights.
Yeah, it's this profound image of God's like presence with the people there. Like he's dining. They're dining with him. He's that notion.
Yeah. It's not even a God, like God meets them halfway up and says, you guys stop right there or I'll kill you. Moses, come with me.
Yeah.
They have a whole meal.
Right. But that follows upon their having been, use that word, sanctified by the blood of the covenant.
Yes. And then they have this meal in the presence of God who is in heaven on the sapphire pavement that's not on the mountain anywhere.
Right. Right. Somehow that which is eternally above and separated from mere people, they're in the presence of that.
Yes. And so this is how it was in the old covenant. We ain't even to the new covenant yet. This is just Moses.
Right.
Now,
you want to go back or are we still here?
Yeah, let's go to 9:23 and
all right, down to 23. All right.
So that's the picture. That's what we're bringing into this. Now, what's it like now? If that's what the old covenant's like, what's the new covenant like? Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, that is, the blood, the ashes of the heifer, all that. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these, of course, right? Earthly shadow, earthly sacrifices. So what do you purify the heavenly tabernacle with?
It's that how much more argument. If you had to have blood to sacrifice, to sanctify the old, there has to be blood to sanctify this new.
And it has to be better. It's got to be,
has to be better. Yeah.
What do you, the blood of bulls and goats was fine for the shadow, but this is the real thing. What do you bring to that? Well, no, not good enough.
Right. Right.
For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself now, important word, to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. For those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation.
Man, it's a lot there. All right. That's a lot there. That's a heavy
Yeah,
passage.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So walk through it because there's so much good stuff.
Oh,
in
yeah.
there.
So that argument from the lesser to the greater, if this is how it worked in the first covenant, and remember, in the first covenant, 70 elders saw into heaven.
Right.
Purified with the blood of bulls and goats. They're seeing the sapphire pavement. They're seeing God. And for whatever reason, Moses finds it necessary to say, but he didn't touch them. But they're seeing it, like, so they're close enough that he could have. What are we? And they're having a meal. He's at the table with them. They're having a meal in God's presence and seeing heaven on the side of Mount Sinai. And that's what that blood did. What in the world do you do? And what happens when you do it?
Right.
Like,
you always have to wonder, going back to your story of the tribe elder. I know that a ramble you provided for me, but what might that even be? It almost begs to be answered. What kind of sanctification would be sufficient for this new covenant that is implicit in the priesthood and is implicit in, and it's stated in Psalms and in Jeremiah? Like what would even qualify for that kind of work?
Right. It's the big mystery. How does this even work? And Jesus says to the apostles, remember, holy men desired to look into the things that you now see, and didn't see it, couldn't figure it out. And here we are.
Right.
So Jesus comes into not the earthly tabernacle or the earthly temple, but the heavenly tabernacle. The substance, not the shadow.
Where the real work is done.
Yes. And
the permanent work, the perfect work. I shouldn't say real, where the perfect work is done.
That's fair. Yeah. It was real, but it was always designed to become obsolete.
Right.
And now he doesn't show up with some animal. He shows up with his own blood.
Yeah.
And as the perfect and innocent sacrifice, that puts an end to the whole thing. It's done. Nothing, there's nothing you could possibly add to that.
Yeah. Yeah. How could you replace the perfect with that which was an imperfect precursor? Why would that would make no sense?
And you intend to, this is one of the more intuitive arguments against salvation by works. Like, Jesus does this.
Yeah.
And you intend to show up and be like, I gave a homeless guy a Cliff Bar. Yeah, and like,
yeah.
How are you going to add to this? What could you possibly bring to the table?
Well, it seems to me that if you were to say that you could in principle add to it, then you would be suggesting the imperfection of what Jesus has done.
Yes.
And for whatever arguments from piety are worth, that's an argument from piety to even suggest that Jesus's sacrifice was imperfect. I cringe at that thought.
Yeah. Do we build on it? Do we honor it? Like, typologically reenact it? Yeah, we do. And Paul talks about this. There's a verse in Colossians that
I was thinking that verse as I was saying my little argument from impiety.
Yeah, you can't say this out loud without getting in trouble, and then you have to point out the verse in Colossians to get yourself out of trouble. But Paul writes to the Colossians and says, I fill up in my flesh that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for you. Like, you would never dare, you would never do. But Jesus never went to Colossae. Neither did Paul, actually. But Jesus was not the apostle to the Gentiles, but Paul was.
Right.
That's the job he gave him to do. He said, "Greater works than these." Here's one of them. And you have that extension. Yeah. Do we reenact what Christ did in our own limited way?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And do we suffer on behalf, if we're following Christ, do we end up suffering in order that others may be glorified? Yes,
Right.
absolutely we do. Of course we do.
Right. Yeah, there might be a theology in which we take this sacrifice, this perfect blood of Christ, into every area of our lives and into the world in which we ourselves become bearers of suffering, whereby the blood of Christ is brought to that place. But to suggest that I add to that blood, that I add to the value of that sacrifice, to me is
yeah, no.
That just, I get uncomfortable even thinking in those terms.
Yeah, what you're doing is honoring what was done. What you're doing is following what was done. You are not like, okay, the full price was $100 and this gets me to 95, but let me see what I can grubble up from the couch. Jesus took care of it.
So again, and in the context of this argument, he's been talking about service, where I'm called to serve God because I've been made holy because Christ is holy, because that whole argument, right? So I can take that to the world, and I should, but my taking the holiness of Christ, or that I've been made to the world, in no way can be construed to be a part of making me holy. How can I add to that?
No, and that even under the old covenant, that's not how that worked. You sanctify an implement for service in the tabernacle with something else. You don't pick up the ladle that you're going to use and sanctify it by like letting it be in its ladleness. Like you bring something else to it. You bring the blood of the sacrifice, the ashes of the red heifer, you sprinkle it, and that sanctifies the ladle. Right? If I'm the implement, I can't of myself generate the required purity that's brought to me through the sacrifice. And then I serve. And I serve not in order that you don't, once you've logged 100 hours of service with this ladle, now it's holy. No. You make it holy first, and then you serve with it because it's been made holy.
Right.
And this is how Hebrews presents sanctification and presents holiness. You are made holy by Jesus' sacrifice. His blood has been applied to you. Right. Now you serve because you've been made holy, not in order to become holy.
So for those of us who really like theological language, we can say here he's speaking of positional sanctification. If you want to insist on that sort of high level language.
Yeah, we're not talking about I'm gonna do enough of this and then I will be something.
Is that relevant? I'm sure it is. Is that relevant to the notion of he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself? This putting away of sin, that can feel, maybe there's a truth to this about this progressive nature of putting away sin daily. But again, are we still talking positionally in ultimate terms where Christ has, how are you taking that?
Okay, so here's where the reason I just didn't just say yes when you said positional sanctification,
right,
is because yes, there's something important that we're getting at there. It's already done. Often in that discourse, though, we distinguish between positional and practical sanctification, and then what ends up happening is, so in a heavenly ledger somewhere, an entry has been made but you're not really sanctified. You're really sanctified. Like God's got his thumb on the scales on your behalf. And like, as far as, there's a spreadsheet someplace, but in real terms, and the positional practical divide kind of lends itself to that. And that's actually a problem, because that's not native. Like, that kind of split is not native to Hebrews.
Or to the biblical text as a whole, I might suggest.
Well, yeah, probably. But for our purposes today, Hebrews, he is like, you are as holy as it gets. Mm-hmm. You have been, the blood of Christ has been applied to you. What could you possibly be missing? Mm-hmm. And on that basis, he is going to proceed to set out a program of service that is what that purification was for, just like in the old covenant. And remember, he starts this part of the conversation, even under the first covenant. Right. You had this and this and this and this, and you purify things this way. And now, so for people who are we struggle with this because we are not familiar with the Old Testament system much. Mm-hmm. And we are familiar with struggling with sin every day.
Right.
And so we come in here and it talks about sanctification, and we're like, yeah, the up in heaven somewhere. No. Jesus now ministers in heaven for you. But even under the old covenant, this is why we went back to Exodus 24. Mm-hmm. They ate that meal in heaven. Right. On the flanks of Mount Sinai. 70 elders did. Not just Moses, not just the special guy. Right. Not even just Aaron. 70 elders of Israel, Nadab, Abihu, Moses, Aaron, Joshua's there.
The leaders of the people, the representative of the people themselves,
having been sprinkled by the blood of the covenant, ate a meal with God in heaven. Yeah. And then went back down the mountain. Under the old covenant.
Right. So the new can't be less than that.
The new cannot be less than that. Christ has, like, how holy would you think that you were? You hear this sometimes in Sunday school. How come God doesn't do it like the old, like, pillar of cloud, pillar of fire? I'm here for it. Can we do that? No.
Yeah.
I hear, yeah, and like learning to live a tangibly spiritual life there's another whole jag to go on. We won't. But how holy would you think you were if you're one of those 70 elders and you just ate it? Like, Moses sprinkled you with the blood of the sacrifice, read you the book of the law, you said, I'll do it, and he takes you up on the side of the mountain, and you eat looking across the table at God himself.
Yeah, right.
That's the low-grade version of what we have.
Sure.
Is it real? Yeah.
So that question, is it real? There's this conversation that I had years ago that's just screaming in the back of my mind right now, with a very good friend and even a mentor of mine who is an Orthodox priest. So yes, we're allowed to be friends and have mentors, people who of a faith we don't agree with, right?
Amen.
And he told me one of his biggest objections, why he converted to Orthodoxy. Not that I would ever, that's not my theology, but in his case, he was so, what turned him off of traditional Protestant theology was the constant harping on the legal fiction. That was the word he used. The legal fiction of righteousness. And he thinks in his theological tradition that the righteousness that he believes in is a real righteousness that he gets through his whole sacramental system. And what I'm hearing you talk about is you're denying rather strongly, I'm hearing you anyway, deny rather strongly the legal fiction of our righteousness. You're saying that this is real. It's certainly not less real than they had on that day at Sinai.
Yes, it's legal, but it's not fiction.
Right.
Yeah, there's no, I understand why someone would be turned off by that. There's a pop way of, and this is why I balk at the positional sanctification language.
Sure.
There's a pop way of presenting that where it does come off that way, and that really is objectionable.
Mm-hmm.
That lends itself to doing that Francis Schaeffer kind of upper story, lower story split thing where, like, okay, there's some things happening up there that are somehow, we're obliged to say that they're true, but they don't actually matter in any way that is happening down here.
Yeah.
No, that is not where this is going. This is tangible. This matters for these people in this place. And the charge that he's giving them, what he's just set them up for, is the tabernacle somehow. What Moses saw, God opened a window, and Moses saw the tabernacle in heaven. Jesus has now entered into what Moses saw, and you are the implements of the service of worship in that tabernacle, and you are being purified with the blood of Jesus' sacrifice so that you can be used in the service of that tabernacle. Like, that's what he has given us.
Yeah.
Now,
you yourselves have become the implements.
Yes.
Right.
He could theoretically go on to say, and this is a thing that we can look forward to when we die.
Yep.
And we'll see. Maybe he'll say that, but I don't think so.
The immediate thing beyond that he's talking about beyond our life of service, what he has us look forward to is that Christ is going to come back for salvation, this time apart from sin. But that's not,
yeah.
I mean, that's there not is about something when I die.
There is something that we look forward to, but it's not heavenly service then.
Yeah. Nice. Well said. Right. There's heavenly service now, and we're waiting for our deliverance in the future. And that would have meant a lot, going back to the historical situation. That would have meant, or should have meant, a lot to the readers.
Yes, they're undergoing a lot that one might want to be saved from.
Right. Might it be a stretch? I stretch all the time. You know that. Might it be a stretch to say even the suffering that you are going through, dear reader, the original readers, all this persecution, this itself is part of the implement, the service that God is using all this for. This is all part what God is doing with you. And so just hang on and trust that Jesus has you.
Possibly. I'd be a little reluctant at this point in the book to, like, he's going to draw some lines as we get further into what, what specifically is he talking about when he's talking about service in the heavenly tabernacle. He's going to have some very specific things as we get into the practical instruction that he hits us with. And it's easy. Like, these are verses that we quote all the time.
Oh yeah. And
completely miss the implications of the way that he states them.
Well, for man wants to die, that's just kind of thrown out. And the idea earlier on about without blood, there's no remission of sins. Those are true, just taken out of context. But he's using these principles as a part of a much larger argument about the superiority of what Christ is doing. It can't be less than what was done before.
Mm-hmm. And not just the superiority of Christ, what Christ is doing, but the superiority of what Christ, our high priest and forerunner, is doing with us.
Yeah. Right. Well said, of course. Hmm. Hmm. So where's your takeaway for this right now? Because that's obviously heavy stuff. Where's your takeaway for us right now?
Um, I mean, I mean, one of them would be take the invitation of 9:5. Go back, get into the second half of Exodus and Leviticus and read and just see
Yeah.
what was what are we being invited to think through?
Mm-hmm.
What does it look like if I know if what he's setting me up for is I'm a ladle or a set of tongues or a something in the service of the heavenly tabernacle.
Right.
I'm an implement for service in the heavenly tabernacle. Cool. How does any of that work? What's that mean?
Right.
Well, let's go back and look at it. And all these down into the details, he makes a point of saying down into the details. There's something to talk about there. And this is, yeah, it's pointing to Christ, but it's also pointing to something that I am being, speaking of election for service, like I am being chosen in Christ to do.
Yeah.
So there's like we like to
There's a
say,
shadow of us there, not just a shadow of Christ.
yes, us in Christ are like he's our forerunner. We come behind him. He's sanctifying us for service in the heavenly tabernacle. So as much as we like to say, look, man, it's not all about you, sometimes it is.
Yeah.
You know, because it's about Jesus and we are in him, and there's something he wants us to know about what that means. And he's going to go in some very specific places about what to do with that.
Yeah.
Or like where specifically we should be going with that. But even before we get there, just go back and look and learn. It's one of the things. Okay, I'm going to go bump up to systematic theology and go on a jag for a second.
All right.
But one of the things that the fruits of the Protestant Reformation, one of the real glories of the Reformation, was the recovery of the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we have done terribly with that doctrine is we have absolutely failed to grasp the priesthood of all believers. What we actually do in application is the priesthood of nobody.
Wow.
What we mean by the priesthood of all believers is that guy with the mitre on his head is not a priest. You don't need him to go to God for you.
Yeah.
You can go, right? But if I don't need that guy to go to God for me because I can go because I'm a priest, what do priests do?
Right. They go to God for people.
Yes. There's always three people involved in a priesthood transaction. There's God, there's the priest, and there's somebody that priest is bringing near to God. Always. That's how priesthood works.
Yeah.
If I'm a priest and Christ is my forerunner and I'm coming behind him, I have a duty as I go out into the world to bring people to God.
Right.
And I know, of course, I can't. Jesus is the mediator between God and man. I can't do what he did.
Sure.
But I can participate
Right.
in what he did.
As the priests, in some sense, participated in the high priest's ministry, doesn't invalidate their own ministry.
Yes. The guy who's offering the ascension offering every morning isn't necessarily the high priest.
Right.
That offering depends on the Yom Kippur offering, but yeah, there's a ministry that I have where I should be functioning as a priest. And this trips us up because we don't know what priests do. We don't really have a picture of that. And
Mm.
again, this is where take the invitation, go back, read Exodus, read Leviticus, get a picture of what that first covenant priests
Mhm.
do. We're not going to do precisely the same thing, but God knew what he was going to do here
Sure.
when he did that, and that's a shadow of this. So there are lessons that we're meant to learn from that, and we
It's
can't learn them if we don't read it.
it's almost as if, and maybe not almost, maybe it is if it is the case that to the extent that we tend to read the Old Testament, the law, we tend to say, okay, I'm going to learn enough about Leviticus and the tabernacle to realize that what I need to know is that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins, and Jesus fulfills that law. I've got what I need out of Leviticus. Move on. And you're saying that, yeah, fine, that's true, and that's fabulous and good and important. But the rest of it's fabulous and good and important too, dependent though it may be on that larger truth. There is something that reflects in what the Christian priesthood is as well.
Yeah, if
Not
that's
a
if
one-to-one correspondence, but there is
no,
something there for us.
9:1 through 5 doesn't make sense unless there's more there.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is, okay, you got the shedding of blood is necessary. Jesus did that once for all. Great. That's certainly shouldn't get less than that. That's the big E on the eye chart.
Right.
But there's more to it. You're leaving if that's all you walk away with. I mean, if you're gonna grab one thing, that's the thing.
That's the thing, right?
I don't
That's the
want to
big one.
minimize the importance of that, but you left a lot of money on the table,
Right.
and there's a lot
Right.
more that God has for us there.
Right. Yeah, that statement that is gonna ring in my mind. It can't be less than that, because that seems to be the whole off fortiori argument he's making. Even the first covenant had, even okay, then it learn the first covenant so you know that not only what it pointed to it fulfills them, but it's got to be at least that and then more.
Yes,
And I feel like a lot of people don't know what's in the first. They know the first only enough to justify their understanding of the need for the cross. But again, yeah, but there's more.
there's more, and often like we'll get into Leviticus and we'll read something about not wearing clothing
Right.
from mixed fibers and not eating shrimp. And we're like, well, thank God I don't live under that. And that's our big takeaway.
Right.
Open my eyes that I may see terrible things in your law. That's not what the verse says.
Right.
There's a glory in it. There's a beauty in it. God is doing all of that is for a purpose.
Yeah.
And Hebrews is a great window to look through
Yeah.
in order to go back and start getting more than just, okay, we needed a sacrifice and Jesus is that sacrifice.
So, invitation to viewers and listeners and readers. After you finish Hebrews with us, delve into the Torah, delve into Leviticus, delve into the latter part of Exodus, and see what's there, because it's not this irrelevant. If you think it's irrelevant, you have a problem with Hebrews 9.
Yes. Like how is he? Why is he wasting all this time on this?
Right. And it could be, and that part of the reason that we struggle with what am I doing as a Christian, maybe because we don't understand what our role is, because we don't understand the picture of our role. Maybe
This
that's
is a
part of
lot of
it.
where this is a lot of where I'm involved in some work with helping especially younger people develop a tangible spirituality.
Yeah.
Um, we live in a world where if you're interested in spirituality and spiritual things, and
Right.
your best you're in eighth grade or whatever, and your best friend just betrayed you, and you
Yeah.
want to kind of live a spiritual life, but then you've got this thing going on. Man, you can go on Pinterest or wherever and down and somebody's got a spell for what to do. Like you'll get this color candle and get this kind of rock, and
Yeah.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
go someplace and do this thing and chant this, and right
Mm-hmm.
there's instructions.
Yeah, it's
And
real. It's there.
man, when you poppy sort of evangelicals are fond of being like, ah, that's just superstition. No, the spirit world is a real play is real, and that like when you dial that number, all too
There's
often
something there.
something answers, and that is very not good.
Right.
Um, that's what we're up against.
Yep.
The biblical view of the world gives us the resources to tackle that and go one better.
Yeah.
Don't, don't eat from the table of demons. Just don't do it. That thing wants to eat your face. Bring it to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Come eat at his table, receive strength to do what you need to do, and
And
then we'll
then watch
walk
the
through.
real effect it's going to have. It's going to be real. There's going to be an actual tangible impact. It's real.
And we remember back to the old covenant. They ate a meal. They with God at the table, in God's presence.
Yeah.
God was in heaven and on the flanks of Mount Sinai at the same time, and they ate in his presence there. And it can't be less than that.
Right. Are you suggesting, Tim, sarcastic question, that our faith as evangelicals and Protestants is not this merely rationalism where we can just kind of put the right doctrine in the right place and check a theological quiz and be good?
You
That's not all
know,
that it is.
if yeah, not exactly, no. Um, there's too many of us. Like, having our doctrinal paperwork in order is important to us, which is fine. That's important. But too many of us, having gotten there, are then basically materialists with a white list of biblical miracles that we have to sign off on in order
Yeah.
to be meaningfully Christian. And that's it.
Yeah.
And that it falls woefully short of a biblical view of reality. And
Amen
we
to
want
that.
to be dealing in the full spectrum of reality.
I have a lot that I can run off on that because some recent studies, I'll tell you about them later on offline, but that's amen is what I'm going to say to that. Amen. And a lot of that. Very good. Oh, and we are a bit longer than I expected today, which is okay. It's always great stuff.
We are.
Anything else that you want to touch on before we land this plane today?
No. Next time, we had a comment asking when we were going to get to chapter 10.
Yeah, we
So
did.
next time, I don't know if we'll get late chapter 10 next time, but we'll see.
Yeah. It's another one of those big black hole verses. So if you want to go through the whole thing, we will. And if you want to do it in 2 parts, we can do that as well. We'll just take it as it goes, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, Tim, as always, I'm going to say thank you again, as always, dear viewers. I want to say thank you all for watching. And until next time we see you, may God richly bless you.